So, welcome guys to my first tutorial for a swamped Necron slash Adeptus Mechanicus base. You can use this for any kind of, well, of course for any kind of base, but especially with the upcoming Indomitus box announced by Games Workshop, I thought it would be a great idea to show you some example of a Necron themed base. So as you can see here, I use many materials from Green Stuff World, although you can exchange this easily to any other company. The only thing you will really use are these crystals or some type of crystals and rolling pins from especially the Necronic rolling pin from Green Stuff World. You can find all links below this video if you want to order. All the other stuff is optional, and I will try to cover it as cheap as possible. This little fellow is good for plant materials and will be reviewed in a future video. So I use simple plaster. This is a German company, very cheap, just 2 to 3 euro. So like around $3. You can find it in any kind of do-it-yourself store. Of course, you can use texture medium from like AK Interactive or Vallejo. These little things made the rolling cable maker from Green Stuff World, and some cork I will use later onwards. So let's get started. I use some milliput, netted thoroughly. I use a simple blister cardboard to avoid the necessity cleaning my cutting mat. So just as a little tip, you can easily put some water on it and form little balls, little easy to use piece of milliput, and of course all your bases. And here's important to know that you don't really have to think about where you want this kind of Necronic or Necron typed ground. Just put it randomly in little patches on your bases. Random is always better than being too repetitive. So I push some little balls onto the bases to cover everything. Remember, you don't have to be as neat as possible. Just squeeze them on. Try not to get a very thick layer. That's not good, because you don't want to increase the height of your models a lot, especially if you go competitive. And it looks more realistic if you keep it as flat as possible. If you plan to use some liquid water for the whole base, like resin water, 2-component water, or still water from Vallejo, and you really want to get a layer, you should consider creating the base before putting them on your plastic base. So create the layer of green stuff or milliput or whatever modeling compound you use, let it dry, and you should consider doing this before you put the final painted base layer on top of your plastic base. The surface of such a base is beveled, and that means if you put this into a mold, the resin liquid, as you can see here demonstrated, will flow into this space, and that's not looking very good. So if you plan to use still water and you don't want to let it run around the plastic base, prepare your base before, but I will also cover this in a future video. So I will speed up a little bit. I will put some pieces at the corner, really to the edge of the base. That looks quite good. You can use a damp piece of cotton swab, or even your knife or whatever to flatten it, but that's not really necessary so far. So use a wetted rolling pin You can also use Vaseline to do that, but then you have to use some soap after the compound has hardened. Otherwise, your color, your base won't stick to the surface. So find the way working for you. I'm not very thorough here. I'm just, rolling over. I have some rough edges, but I will cover everything with earth and mud. So for me, this looks more natural, so I don't bother having some kind of very uneven edges. You can also use and put many bases, a few bases close to each other and roll over your, I don't know, like 3, 4, 5 bases simultaneously. Could save you some time, as you can see here, but just try to really wetten your rolling pin before, otherwise the material and especially such a few things will stick to your rolling pin, as you can see here. So everything is done. I use now my cheap plaster, put this into an empty blister pocket. As I mentioned before, I hate cleaning up stuff, so I use disposable things as much as I can, but without wasting it. So I have this here. Of course, I would never buy plastic stuff just to discard, but I love to use equipment I have without being too wasteful. So I use a little spatula to simply put some plaster on top of the base. I don't really care, like I mentioned, if this is now done perfectly. It should just cover the plastic part because you want to give your base some texture. You can use, of course, a wooden spatula or even a straw or whatever you have available. And in a minute we will use a dampened cotton swab to give it a more earth-like texture. This specific plaster creates little spikes if you not careful and won't look very natural. So a damp cotton swab will solve that issue. But of course, like I mentioned before, you can use whatever modeling compound you want. Texture medium. I know that Vallejo and AK Interactive have some very interesting mud and earth textures. I use them as well, but for this project I just wanted to try something new. I will add some cork later, but before I do that I will use now the swamp cotton brush swab and gently apply a little water on top of the base, and I will just carefully press down the cotton swab to create a more like flat earth, muddy earth texture. Most of this will be later painted and covered with some grass flock and the material I've shown in the intro. So don't be too thorough, just avoid having some little spiky parts of the plaster. That's not looking good. So it's just an example, and I do this with every base. So now I use the Green Stuff World crystals for putting in my crystals on top of the base. For me, this should look like they formed out of the material and I will some glow later. This is just my way of, I wanted some glowing crystals, so I will spray them. Over. Maybe I will leave some of it not covered with the base primer, but this comes in part 2 in the painting tutorial. Always keep in mind, position your material and position your models on top of the base to really ensure that that your model still has space. I learned this the hard way. I created some, from my understanding, very nice looking bases and then had no real place to place my model on, which was somehow frustrating, so avoid that problem. I use an X-Acto knife to form the leaves a little bit, to put them into a little droplet of super glue and arrange them in the way I want. I will also add some with the paint and some other texturing material later. It will cover the center area and look very natural. You will see that. You can also watch my leaves and plants tutorial where I will review different materials. Now, this is made from cardboard paper, and I will put again a little droplet of super glue in the middle, and I will also sometimes just put the leaf on the base directly, like it has been ripped off of another fan or bush. So gives a little nice texture. But if you want to paint it, don't press it too much into the plaster. It will make the paint job later harder, more difficult. So that's pretty much it for part 1. I let this dry at least 24 hours. So long is usually not necessary, but then you can be sure that everything is dry and ready for step 2. See you soon. Thank you for watching. Please remember, subscribe, share, like. That will help me a lot to produce more videos. Thank you.